Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video.
Story 1. Don't open the door. The small town of Hawksridge had always prided itself on being a place of stability. There were no towering skyscrapers or labyrinthine highways to overshadow the simplicity of its cobblestone streets and creaking wooden houses. The town square, with its aging clock tower, remained the heart of the community, and the residents lived by routines as predictable as the turning of the seasons. Yet there was one thing that even the oldest inhabitants of Hawksridge would not speak of: a house at the edge of town with a door no one dared to open. The house stood slightly apart from its neighbors, perched atop a low hill, its weather-worn facade looming like a sentinel over the sleepy streets below. It wasn't abandoned, though it might as well have been. The shutters were perpetually drawn, the chimney rarely puffed smoke, and the garden grew wild with weeds that reached hungrily for the fence. The house seemed alive in its silence, its presence oppressive and cold, like an unspoken warning to those who passed by. No one could remember who had built the house or who had lived there last. Even the town's oldest residents would only mutter vague remarks about how it was best left alone. Every child in Hawksridge had grown up hearing the same admonishment: never open the door. But children, as children do, were prone to mischief, and curiosity about the house had led to dares and whispered legends. Yet every attempt to approach it ended the same way, with an overwhelming sense of unease that sent the boldest children running back to safety. It was late autumn when Eleanor returned to Hawksridge. She had left the town 10 years earlier for university, vowing never to return to its stifling routines and suffocating small-mindedness. But life had a way of unraveling plans, and when her mother passed, Eleanor found herself back in the very place she had spent her youth yearning to escape. The house was the first thing she noticed upon her return. As the taxi wound its way through the familiar streets, her gaze was drawn to it. Something about its sagging roof and cracked paint stirred a memory she couldn't quite place, like a tune half remembered from a dream. "Still standing, is it?" the driver muttered, catching her stare. Eleanor turned to him, startled. "What do you mean?" The driver shrugged, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "That house. Folks say it's cursed. Been here longer than anyone can recall. Best to steer clear of it, miss." Eleanor frowned but said nothing. The idea of a cursed house seemed absurd, a relic of the town's penchant for superstition. Yet, as the taxi pulled away from the station and carried her to her childhood home, she found herself glancing back at the house until it disappeared from view. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor busied herself with the grim task of sorting through her mother's belongings. The house she had grown up in felt both familiar and alien, each room a repository of memories she had tried to leave behind. There were moments when she felt the weight of those memories pressing down on her, but she forced herself to push through. She had no intention of staying in Hawksridge longer than necessary. One evening, as she sifted through a box of old photographs, she came across an image that made her pause. It was a faded black and white photo of a group of children standing in front of a house. Her mother was among them, a little girl with braids and a serious expression. But it wasn't her mother's face that caught Eleanor's attention. It was the house behind her, It was the house on the hill. Eleanor stared at the photo, a chill creeping down her spine. The door of the house was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. The children's faces were solemn, their eyes fixed on the camera, but there was something about their expressions that unsettled her. It was as if they had seen something they couldn't unsee. "Don't open the door." The voice startled Eleanor, and she looked up sharply. But the room was empty, and the voice, her mother's voice, she realized, had come from her own memory. She set the photo aside, her hands trembling. She had no recollection of her mother ever saying those words, but the warning felt familiar, like an echo of something long forgotten. As the days passed, Eleanor found herself drawn to the house on the hill. She told herself it was just curiosity, a way to distract herself from the monotony of packing and the ache of grief. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The house had taken root in her thoughts, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, unable to resist any longer, she made her way to the hill. The air seemed colder as she approached, the wind whispering through the tall grass like a warning. The house loomed above her, its windows dark and uninviting. For a moment she hesitated, a primal fear gripping her. But she forced herself to take another step, and then another, until she stood before the door. It was an ordinary door, weathered and unremarkable. Yet, as she reached out to touch the handle, a wave of nausea washed over her. Her hand froze inches from the wood, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. "Don't open the door." The words echoed in her mind, louder this time, more insistent. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. She turned and fled, not stopping until she reached the safety of her mother's house. Her pulse was still racing as she locked the door behind her, the weight of the house's presence lingering like a shadow. That night, Eleanor dreamed of the house. She stood before the door, her hand on the handle, unable to pull away. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the light. She stepped inside, and the world dissolved into a void of whispers and shadows. When she woke, her sheets were damp with sweat, and the memory of the dream clung to her like a second skin. The next morning, she decided to visit the town's library. If anyone had answers about the house, she reasoned, it would be the librarian, Mrs. Thatcher, who had a reputation for knowing the town's history better than anyone. Mrs. Thatcher was seated at her usual desk, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she pored over a ledger. She looked up as Eleanor approached, her expression softening with recognition. "Eleanor, dear, it's been years. How are you holding up?" Eleanor offered a tight smile. "I'm managing. Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something." Mrs. Thatcher nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "What is it, dear?" "The house on the hill," Eleanor began, choosing her words carefully. "Do you know anything about it?" The librarian's face darkened, and she leaned back in her chair. "That house has a history, but it's not one people like to talk about. Best to leave it alone." Eleanor's frustration flared. "Why does everyone say that? What happened there?" Mrs. Thatcher hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. "There are stories," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stories about people who went inside and never came out. About things that shouldn't be there. But those are just stories." "And the door," Eleanor pressed. "Why does everyone say not to open it?" Mrs. Thatcher's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Eleanor thought she wouldn't answer. But then the librarian sighed. her shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. Because once you open it, you can't close it again. The librarian's words haunted Eleanor as she made her way home. The town's reluctance to speak of the house only deepened her resolve to uncover its secrets. She began scouring her mother's belongings for clues, searching for anything that might explain the photograph or the house's ominous reputation. But her efforts yielded nothing, and the sense of unease continued to grow. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself standing at the foot of the hill once more. The moon cast an eerie glow over the house, its shadows stretching like grasping fingers. She told herself she wouldn't go inside, that she just wanted to see it up close. But as she climbed the hill, the pull of the house became irresistible. The door was just as she remembered it, its surface scarred and weathered. She reached out, her hand trembling as it closed around the handle. For a moment she hesitated, the weight of the librarian's warning pressing down on her. But then, with a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. What lay beyond defied explanation. The interior of the house was impossibly vast, a labyrinth of corridors and staircases that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air was heavy with a sense of wrongness, and the walls pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. Eleanor's footsteps echoed in the silence as she stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Mrs. Thatcher had been right. The door could not be closed again, and she was not alone. Story 2, The House That Whispers. The village of Ashton was a place of quiet discontent, nestled in the crook of a valley that the sun rarely graced with its warmth. The townsfolk were unremarkable, their lives stitched together by the threads of routine and superstition. A bakery here, a church there, and at the center of it all, the house. It had no proper name, only whispered references. The house on the hill, the old Braxton place, that cursed thing. The Braxtons, long gone, were little more than an unpleasant memory. Pale, strange-eyed folk who spoke little and rarely came to town. When they vanished, leaving the house abandoned, no one questioned it too deeply. It was better that way. The house sat at the edge of the forest, its roofline jagged and uneven like the grin of a thing that should not smile. Its windows stared out over the valley like empty, watching eyes, and the wind that moved through its rotting beams carried with it a peculiar sound. Some said it was just the groan of wood giving way to time, but others swore they heard whispers. By the time Clara Harper arrived in Ashton, the house had been empty for 20 years. Clara was not one to believe in whispers or curses. A woman of plain sense and fewer words, she had come to escape a past she did not care to discuss. The house, with its low asking price and acres of untended land, seemed the perfect retreat. The villagers tried to warn her. Old Mrs. Merriweather at the grocer's counter leaned in conspiratorially, whispering, "You won't last a month up there, dear." None of them do. A wiry man named Ellis, whose position as the town's unofficial historian lent him an air of authority, offered grim details about the Braxton family's peculiar habits, how they'd spoken to no one, but often to themselves. People heard things, he said. Voices coming from the house when there was no one home. Clara smiled politely at their stories and bought the house anyway. She moved in on a wet October afternoon, her boots sinking into the mud of the overgrown driveway. The house loomed above her, silent and inscrutable. Inside, the air was thick with damp and disuse, but Clara saw only the potential. She set to work immediately, scrubbing the floors and clearing the cobwebs. For the first week, it was just a house. But then the whispers began. The first time Clara heard it, she was crouched in the parlor, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the floorboards. The whisper was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves stirred by a soft breeze. She straightened, her brush suspended mid-scrub, and tilted her head toward the sound. "Hello," she called, her voice startlingly loud in the silence. Nothing answered. She dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the house settling, or the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But the sound returned the next evening, just as she was turning down the lamps. This time it came from the hallway, a low murmur that didn't quite form words, but carried the unmistakable cadence of speech. "Is someone there?" Clara demanded, her tone firmer now. She stood at the base of the stairs, the lamplight casting long, flickering shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Again, no reply. The next morning, Clara went into town for supplies, though she found herself lingering longer than usual at the grocer's counter. She chatted idly with Mrs. Merriweather, her questions carefully wrapped in casual observation. "Strange how quiet it is up there," she said, avoiding the woman's sharp gaze. "The kind of quiet that makes you hear things that aren't there." Mrs. Merriweather's expression darkened. "Oh, they're there, all right." The Braxtons were dabblers, you know. Called up things they had no business calling. And when they left, well, whatever they brought stayed behind. Clara forced a laugh. "Ghost stories. I suppose every old house has them." Mrs. Merriweather leaned in close. "Ghosts don't whisper, dear. They wail, they moan, they cry for what they've lost. Whispers belong to the living, or to something that was never alive in the first place." The remark followed Clara back to the house, lingering in her mind like the echo of a half-remembered song. By the second week, the whispers were no longer faint or intermittent. They came every evening, growing louder and more insistent as the night deepened. They didn't seem to come from any one place, but rather from everywhere at once, weaving through the rooms like threads of sound. At first, Clara tried to drown them out with the phonograph she'd found in the attic, its scratchy records spinning out jaunty tunes from a bygone era. But the whispers seeped through, mingling with the music until the cheerful melodies felt grotesque. Then she tried ignoring them, telling herself that if she didn't acknowledge the sounds, they would fade on their own. But the whispers had a way of creeping into her thoughts, unraveling her concentration until even the simplest tasks became impossible. It wasn't until the night she found the writing on the wall that Clara began to question her sanity. She'd been in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes by the light of an oil lamp, when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned sharply, her gaze sweeping over the empty room. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The whispers surged in response, a sudden crescendo that sent a chill skittering down her spine. They were louder now, clear enough to pick out fragments. "She doesn't belong. Why is she here? Send her away." Clara's hand tightened around the edge of the sink as she fought the urge to flee. Instead, she grabbed the lamp and stalked into the hallway, her pulse hammering in her ears. That was when she saw it. Words scrawled in dark, jagged strokes across the faded wallpaper. "Leave." Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat in the parlor, the lamp burning low, and stared at the wall until dawn. By morning, the writing was gone, the wallpaper as faded and peeling as it had always been. But Clara knew what she'd seen. The villagers watched her with wary curiosity when she returned to town that afternoon, her face pale and drawn. She didn't mention the whispers or the writing. Instead, she bought nails, boards, and a heavy lock for the bedroom door. "Is everything all right up there?" Ellis asked as he rang up her purchases. "Just fine," Clara lied. That night, Clara barricaded herself in the bedroom, the door locked and bolted. She told herself that whatever was in the house couldn't hurt her, that the whispers were just noise and the writing a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The whispers began as they always did, soft and scattered, but this time they didn't stay in the background. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers but voices. "Go back. You don't belong here." And then beneath the voices, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic thumping, as if something heavy was moving through the house. Clara pressed herself against the headboard, her breath shallow and rapid. She clutched the lamp like a talisman, its feeble light casting trembling shadows on the walls. The thumping grew closer, the voices rising in a cacophony of anger and despair. The door rattled violently, the lock straining against the force on the other side. Clara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. In the morning, Clara found the door ajar, the lock broken clean off. She packed her belongings with shaking hands and left without looking back. The villagers didn't seem surprised when she appeared in town, her car loaded and her face pale with exhaustion. "Told you," Mrs. Merriweather said, her tone not unkind. Clara didn't reply. The house remained empty after that, its whispers fading back into the silence of the hill. But on quiet nights, when the wind was still and the valley was cloaked in shadow, the villagers swore they could hear it, the low, mournful murmur of a house that had grown tired of waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. Story 3, The Last Night on Elm Street. Elm Street had always been a quiet place, the kind of neighborhood where nothing remarkable ever happened. It was lined with modest homes, their paint faded by the sun, and their gardens tended with varying degrees of care. The street lights, spaced unevenly along the road, cast weak pools of amber light that barely touched the darkness between them. The residents of Elm Street were ordinary people living ordinary lives, or so they seemed. If one paid close attention, though, they might notice something unsettling, how the curtains twitched more often than they should, or how the mailboxes seemed to overflow with letters never retrieved. But it was the house at the very end of the street that drew the most attention. No one lived there, at least not anymore. It was the kind of house children dared each other to touch on Halloween, and teenagers avoided when sneaking out after dark. The windows were boarded up, the garden overrun with weeds, and the air around it felt thick, like the lingering echo of something unspeakable. Everyone on Elm Street had a story about the house, though no two were the same. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering behind the boarded windows. Others swore they heard whispers when they passed by. A few even remembered the family who once lived there, a mother, a father, and their 2 young daughters. They were quiet folk, the kind who never caused trouble, until one night they were gone. Just like that, it was on a cool autumn evening, when the trees along the street were ablaze with color, that the house began to stir. It started small, with a faint vibration that rattled the loose boards on the porch. Most of the residents dismissed it as the wind or the natural settling of an old structure, but by nightfall, the street was plunged into an oppressive silence, as if the world were holding its breath. That was when the lights came on. They flickered to life one by one, pale and cold, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp and panicked, before cutting off abruptly. At number 47, Helen Draper sat bolt upright in her armchair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She had lived on Elm Street for 20 years and had never seen the house illuminated. She reached for the phone to call her neighbor, but the line was dead. Across the street, young Jimmy Corrigan pressed his nose to his bedroom window, his breath fogging the glass. He watched the house with a mixture of fascination and dread, his hands clutching the sill so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Mom," he called, his voice trembling. There was no answer. By midnight, the entire street was awake, their faces pale and drawn as they peered out from behind curtains and blinds. The house seemed alive now, its light spilling out onto the lawn in unnatural patterns. The air hummed with a low vibration just on the edge of hearing that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. Helen Draper was the first to step outside. She was not a brave woman by nature, but something compelled her to leave the safety of her home. She stood on her porch in her slippers and bathrobe, staring down the street toward the house. Behind her, Ellis Carter emerged from his home, his shotgun resting awkwardly in his hands. "You seein' this, Helen?" he called, his voice rough with unease. Helen nodded but said nothing. One by one, the other residents of Elm Street came outside, drawn by the strange light and the feeling that something was about to happen. They gathered in the middle of the street, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes fixed on the house. "Maybe we should call someone," murmured Mary Ellis, clutching her husband's arm. "There's no one to call," Ellis replied grimly. As if in response to his words, the humming grew louder, vibrating through the pavement beneath their feet. The boards covering the house's windows began to creak and splinter, falling away as if pushed from the inside. "What the hell?" someone whispered. The door opened. It swung inward slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The air grew colder, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made Helen think of old pennies and blood. "Who's there?" Ellis called, raising his shotgun. There was no answer, but the darkness inside the house seemed to shift, growing deeper and more oppressive. Then came the sound, a low, guttural moan that started softly but rose in intensity until it became a deafening wail. The residents of Elm Street stood frozen, their feet rooted to the ground, as the sound washed over them. The light from the house pulsed in time with the wail, growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light vanished, plunging the street into darkness. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. When the residents finally found the courage to approach the house, they found the door closed and the windows boarded up once more. There was no sign of the light or the sound, no evidence that anything had happened at all. But the next morning, the Draper house stood empty. And by the end of the week, so did the Corrigan house. One by one, the residents of Elm Street packed their belongings and left, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. By the time the first snow fell, Elm Street was deserted. Story 4, The Stranger in the Window. The house on Alder Lane had always been there, a relic from a time when the town was little more than a cluster of farms and dirt roads. Its facade was warped and weathered, the paint peeling away to reveal the bare wood beneath, and its windows, dark, dusty, and cracked, stared out at the world like half-shut eyes. Everyone in the town knew the house, but no one claimed it, and no one ventured inside. They called it the Watcher's House, though no one could say why. Some said it was because of the way the second-story window seemed to glow faintly at night, even though no one lived there. Others claimed it was because if you stared at that window long enough, you'd see a figure standing there, a stranger who didn't belong to the town, watching you with an intensity that made your skin crawl. For years, the house had been the subject of whispered stories and dares among the children of the town. But as they grew older, they learned to avert their eyes and change the subject, the tales fading into the background noise of adult life. Life was too busy, too ordinary, to entertain the idea of a house that watched back. That was until Claire returned. Claire had left the town 15 years earlier, chasing dreams that had since withered and died. Now, with her career in shambles and her mother gone, she had come back to settle the estate and sell the family home. The town hadn't changed much. The same cracked sidewalks and familiar faces greeted her as she drove down Main Street. But the house on Alder Lane caught her attention immediately. It was still there, unchanged despite the years. As her car passed, her gaze was drawn to the window, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw movement. A shadow, perhaps, or the flutter of a curtain. But there was no breeze. "Still standing," muttered the old man at the gas station later that day when Claire brought it up. "Should have fallen down years ago, the state it's in." "Who owns it?" Claire asked, leaning against the counter. The man who had known her since she was a child frowned. "No one. Ain't been owned in decades. It's, well, best not to think about it." Claire chuckled, though the unease in his voice unsettled her. "You mean it's haunted?" "If it's haunted, it's by something that's been here longer than ghosts," he said, scratching his chin. "Something older." The next few days were a blur of paperwork and memories. Sorting through her mother's belongings was a painful task, each box a Pandora's chest of nostalgia and regret. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the thought of the house lingered, a persistent itch at the back of her mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, Claire found herself standing at the edge of Alder Lane. She hadn't meant to come here. Her feet had carried her of their own accord. The house loomed before her, its silhouette sharp against the fading light. The window on the second floor was dark. Claire stepped closer, her heart pounding. The air around the house felt colder, as if it existed in a different season altogether. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. Her gaze locked on the window, and she felt the absurd urge to call out, to demand that whoever was watching her show themselves. But she didn't. Instead, she took another step, and then another, until she stood at the foot of the porch steps. The door creaked open before she could knock. Inside, the house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made you aware of your own breathing. Dust hung heavy in the air, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. The wallpaper, once floral and cheerful, had faded to a dull yellow, curling at the edges like dead leaves. She called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Hello, is anyone here?" No answer. The staircase to the second floor loomed ahead, its banister smooth and worn. Against her better judgment, Claire climbed the steps. each creak of the wood echoing in the emptiness. At the top, she turned to the door she knew led to the room with the window. It was slightly ajar, just enough to see the sliver of darkness beyond. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. A voice in her mind whispered that she should leave, that whatever lay beyond that door was not meant to be disturbed. But curiosity, and something deeper, something she couldn't name, drove her forward. She pushed the door open. The room was empty. A chill swept over her, and she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the space. The window stood at the far end, its glass smudged and foggy. She approached it, her reflection faint and ghostly in the pane. Beyond the glass, the town stretched out below, the streetlights flickering to life one by one. And then she saw it. In the reflection, a figure stood behind her. Claire spun around, her heart lurching into her throat. But the room was empty, just as before. She turned back to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The figure was gone. The next few nights, Claire dreamed of the house. In her dreams, the stranger was always there, standing in the window, watching her with eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul. The dreams grew more vivid, more oppressive, until she woke each morning drenched in sweat and gasping for air. She began to avoid Alder Lane, taking long detours to avoid even the sight of the house. But it didn't help. The dreams continued, and she began to feel the weight of the stranger's gaze, even during the day. She saw shadows where there shouldn't be any, felt a chill on her neck as though someone was standing just behind her. Desperate for answers, she returned to the gas station and confronted the old man. "What is it about that house? What's in the window?" He shook his head, his expression grim. "I told you, Claire. It's older than ghosts, older than us. Some things just watch." "Watch what?" "Everything," he said simply, "and nothing at all." Claire couldn't stay away. On the last night, driven by an inexplicable need to understand, she returned to the house. The door was open, as if waiting for her. She climbed the stairs again, her body trembling with both fear and anticipation. The room was the same, empty, silent, but this time, when she approached the window, the figure was there. Not in the reflection, but standing in the room with her. It had no face, only a vague, shifting outline that seemed to ripple like water. But its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with a suffocating weight. Claire tried to scream, but no sound came out. She stumbled back, her legs giving way beneath her. The stranger stepped closer, and though it had no eyes, she knew it was looking at her. Into her, through her, and then everything went dark. When the townspeople found the house the next day, it was empty. The door was locked, the windows dark. There was no sign of Claire, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But that night, as the town slept, a faint light glowed in the second-story window. And if you looked closely, you might see a figure standing there, watching. Always watching.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know, you might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.